Imagine this, you're jolted awake by the grinding roar of cement trucks tearing apart the little creek that's flowed behind your house since before the Civil War. Diesel fumes mix with pulverized limestone in the air while you watch $80,000 of homeowner fees vanish into what was once a pristine mountain stream. It's for flood control, declares HOA President Brenda Hartwell from behind the wheel of her spotless white Tesla, smugness radiating off her. What she didn't realize. I wasn't just some clueless property owner. I was a retired Army Corps hydrologist, and what she created wasn't protection, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Fast forward 6 months, her $1 million home sat drowning under 2 feet of swamp water, foundation cracking apart, while my old workshop and battered ranch house stayed high and dry. By then the FBI was knocking on her front door, and that slab of concrete she'd been so proud of was about to bankrupt her. So let me ask, what would you do if your HOA stole your money just to ruin your peace? Where are you tuning in from? Ever had neighbors this unhinged? Because I bet mine aren't the only ones. My name's Dale Brennan. I'm 58, and for most of my life I figured the hardest battle I'd face would be tracking down carburetor parts for my '72 Harley Sportster. Turns out, I was wrong. The real fight came in the form of an HOA president who thought selling houses made her an expert in hydroengineering. See, I inherited my grandfather's 2-acre slice of Colorado heaven. Back when he bought it, Willowbrook was nothing but grazing land, and the only thing HOA stood for was Herd of Angus. My grandfather, William Brennan, was a combat engineer who survived Normandy and came home determined to build something lasting. The creek running through the property was his therapy, his project, his sanctuary. And for me, it became a ritual. Every morning since I retired from the Corps, I'd drink my coffee on the back porch while Cottonwood Creek babbled over granite stones polished smooth by time. The air was rich with the smell of motor oil from my workshop, the tang of wet willow bark, and the rhythmic sound of my boots crunching the gravel paths Granddad had laid down back in 1948. Martha, my wife of 26 years, teaches 4th grade and has the patience of a saint, which turned out to be more important than either of us realized. Our kids. They'd flown the coop. Jessica, saving lives as a trauma nurse in Portland. Mike, knee-deep in debugging code down in Austin. Both of them carrying that Brennan stubborn streak forward. But here's the truth, what made my property valuable wasn't the little ranch house from the 50s, or the piles of greasy motorcycle parts filling my workshop. It was 400 yards of creek with water rights dating back to 1873. That's older than Colorado's statehood, older than electric light bulbs, and definitely older than some suburban queen bee with attitude issues. Then Willowbrook Estates popped up like a field of pricey mushrooms after a storm, 47 oversized houses averaging nearly $900,000 apiece, most bought by Californians escaping their own HOA nightmares. The irony was thicker than the morning mist that rose off the creek. And at the center of this suburban kingdom? Our villain. Brenda Hartwell. 52 years old. Self-appointed queen of perfection. A real estate agent from Marin County, dripping with entitlement and the kind of ignorance that only comes from selling overpriced homes to desperate buyers. She drove that white Tesla everywhere, her vanity plates reading, "Sold for you," pearl earrings hanging off her ears like armor. Her husband? Some high-flying banker making the commute to Denver. Her kids? Enrolled in a pricey private school that probably taught them people like me weren't poor, we just made unfortunate lifestyle choices. Their colonial-style house worth $1.2 million backed right up to my creek. Their immaculately trimmed lawn ended exactly where real nature began. The first shot in our war came on a Tuesday morning, still smelling of hot coffee and dread. A certified letter from the HOA. Violation notice, unsightly storage of automotive parts visible from neighboring properties. Fine, $200 per day until compliance. I read it twice, the absurdity settling in like water soaking into dry earth. Here's what Brenda and her lawyers didn't understand, my property predated their entire subdivision by almost 80 years. My deed included mineral rights, water rights, and exemptions from development restrictions. But they figured I was just some clueless old mechanic who'd never cracked open a property law book. The face-to-face went about as badly as you'd expect. Her office smelled of overpriced candles and arrogance. With a practiced smile straight out of a realtor's handbook, she suggested maybe I'd be happier somewhere with more flexible property standards. Translation: poor folks like me didn't belong near people like her. I answered with a certified letter of my own. HOA covenants don't apply to grandfathered properties. Basic real estate law, day 1. Her retaliation came fast and costly. Anonymous complaints to the county claimed I was running an illegal business out of my workshop. The inspector spent 2 hours crawling around my grease-stained shop before admitting there was nothing wrong, though it still cost me $1,200 in legal fees to prove I wasn't running a chop shop. That was just Brenda testing the waters, both literally and figuratively. Because when she discovered my water rights, that's when the real war began. Water in Colorado isn't just water, it's power. And in Brenda's world, men with grease under their fingernails and deeds older than her subdivision weren't allowed to have it. That's when I realized this wasn't about junk motorcycles. This was going to be a fight for survival. Spring that year came with heavy snowmelt, Cottonwood Creek rushing louder than usual as water spilled over the old Beaver Dam upstream. The sound should have been calming. Instead, it became the ominous soundtrack to Brenda's next big move. This time, she came armed with lawyers. Peton and Associates, a Denver firm that specialized in what they politely called environmental property disputes. Which really meant, they found creative ways to weaponize regulations to squeeze neighbors. Their play was simple but ruthless: file a nuisance water flow complaint with the county. According to their legal papers, my property was responsible for dangerous runoff threatening those million-dollar homes downstream. The complaint landed on my porch in a stack as thick as a Denver phone book, 57 pages of legalese that boiled down to, make the old man prove his 150-year-old creek won't flood our clients' mansions. Their strategy? Force me into a $50,000 environmental impact study. The kind that drags on for 2 years and lines the pockets of consultants who spend more time golfing with lawyers than actually solving problems. That evening, Martha found me standing knee-deep in the creek, boots sinking in the muddy bank, using my grandfather's old surveyor's rod to check flow patterns. "What's going through your head?" she asked, her teacher's voice sharp, like she could already tell I was gearing up for a fight. "I'm thinking Brenda's fancy lawyers just made themselves a $50,000 mistake," I said, watching water swirl around the very boulder my grandfather had set into place by hand back in 1953. "And I'm thinking they picked the wrong engineer to mess with. Here's something 30 years in the Army Corps teaches you: lawyers love to hide behind complex environmental regulations, banking on regular folks not understanding them. What they forget is that some of us actually wrote the systems they're trying to manipulate. It's like watching someone explain how your own motorcycle engine works, to the guy who built it." So I picked up the phone and called an old colleague, Pete Morrison, now at the Colorado Water Authority. Took him less than 10 minutes to spot their fatal mistake. "Dale," Pete chuckled, "they built their whole argument on watershed maps from 1967. Before the interstate, before half those subdivisions even existed, before modern drainage changed everything. These maps are fossils. They don't match reality." He offered to send me the current geological data. And sure enough, the new surveys told an entirely different story. Not only did my stretch of creek not cause flooding, it actually prevented it. The granite boulders my grandfather had arranged weren't just pretty scenery. They created a natural retention system decades before anyone thought to call it that. But here's where it got even sweeter. Colorado water law runs on what's called the prior appropriation doctrine: first come, first served. Since my family had documented water use back to 1873, our rights overruled anything filed afterward, including Brenda's entire subdivision. That weekend, I practically lived in my workshop. Surrounded by the smell of old motor oil, stacks of survey maps, and my grandfather's meticulous engineering notebooks, I traced lines and sketched diagrams late into the night. By Monday morning, I was ready. Instead of just defending myself, I went on offense. I filed a counter-complaint with the county demanding that Brenda's HOA pay for a proper environmental review, since their entire case was based on fraudulent, outdated maps. I attached Pete's expert analysis proving that their development, not my creek, posed the real flood risk. When I delivered the documents, the county water commissioner, Rodriguez, looked them over and couldn't stop laughing. "Mr. Brennan," he said between chuckles, "these people tried to argue water flow against a hydrologist using maps older than Nixon. This might be the shortest water rights case in Colorado history." 2 weeks later, the county sided with me completely. My water rights were reaffirmed, legally validated, and carved into stone for anyone to see. The HOA was ordered to stop harassing me over water issues entirely. The victory felt good, but it also came with unexpected ripples. The local newspaper ran the headline, "HOA challenges century-old water rights, loses spectacularly." Suddenly, neighbors I'd never even spoken to were showing up at my workshop with their own Brenda horror stories. One guy fined for a mailbox that didn't match the approved design. Another family threatened with foreclosure over the shade of paint on their shutters. Even stories about garden gnomes being declared non-compliant decor. That evening, Martha found me by the creek at sunset, my grandfather's fishing rod in hand, though I wasn't really fishing. "He taught me something about water," I told her, watching the stream ripple over ancient stones. "It always finds the easiest path. But it never stops moving toward where it belongs." "And where does this water belong?" she asked softly. I smiled. "Right through the middle of Brenda's perfect little kingdom." You'd think that loss might have humbled her. You'd be wrong. Because if Brenda had a degree, it was in doubling down on terrible decisions. And her next move was so audacious, it almost impressed me. Almost. 3 weeks after the county officially shut down her water rights complaint, Brenda staged her counterstrike. She called an emergency HOA board meeting. Conveniently, she scheduled it the same week Martha and I had planned our first real vacation in years, visiting Jessica in Portland. The notice? Sent to an old address 2 moves ago, ensuring we couldn't attend. On paper, the agenda sounded harmless: emergency flood mitigation assessment. In reality, Brenda strutted into that meeting with a stack of doctored photos showing severe erosion along HOA property. Pictures that, to the trained eye, looked suspiciously like someone had taken a backhoe to the creek bank just days before. Her so-called expert. A consultant who turned out to be her cousin's landscaping contractor. Not an engineer. Not licensed. Just a guy with heavy equipment and a last name that matched hers. The vote passed 6-1. The only dissenter was Edwin Kowalski, a grizzled Polish neighbor with more common sense than the rest of them combined. That night, Edwin called me in Portland, his accent thick with disgust. "Dale, this woman is crazy person. She says flood will destroy everything unless we put concrete in your creek. She has pictures, but something smells wrong, like rotten fish." Sure enough, the board had approved a special assessment. Every homeowner was billed $1,800 to cover what they claimed was emergency flood control infrastructure. Total project cost, $127,000. For work that any real engineer could have told them wasn't just unnecessary, it was destructive. I cut our vacation short, driving all night while Martha dozed fitfully beside me. I gripped the wheel, doing the math in my head. How much destruction could they manage in 72 hours? The answer? Plenty. The sound hit me before the sight did. Jackhammers, diesel engines growling, industrial noise where birdsong used to echo. Then came the smell. Dusty concrete mixing with shredded vegetation. Diesel fumes clinging to the mountain air like an oil slick. When I rounded the corner onto my driveway, the sight nearly broke me. The creek I'd known my whole life, gone. In its place, a lifeless gray trough. Instead of water dancing over granite stones laid by my grandfather's hand, there was a shallow, ugly channel, 18 inches deep, boxed in by concrete walls like something ripped from a prison yard. They'd entombed boulders that had stood for a century, bulldozed fish spawning grounds older than Colorado's statehood, and turned a living stream into a sterile gutter. Martha stood beside me, tears streaking her face. "They killed it," she whispered. "They actually killed a creek." Here's the thing about spending 30 years as a hydrologist, you start thinking like water. And water never lies. I didn't waste time mourning. I documented everything, photos from every angle, water flow readings, samples for lab tests. Then I started digging into the company Brenda had hired, Pinnacle Construction. And boy, did they have a rap sheet. 3 EPA violations in the last 5 years. $75,000 in fines for unauthorized waterway alterations. A pattern of beginning projects before permits were approved. And here's what most homeowners don't know: if you want to change a natural waterway in any significant way, you need 3 layers of approval: county, state, and federal. It's a legal layer cake, and Pinnacle had skipped every slice. Which meant Brenda's project wasn't just reckless. It was illegal on every level. The Clean Water Act alone carries penalties of up to $25,000 per day for unauthorized channeling. Add in state fines, and every single day that concrete sat in my creek was another $35,000 in potential liability. I filed complaints with every relevant agency: County Code Enforcement, the state's Environmental Division, and the EPA's Region 8 office in Denver. Then I called the local Trout Unlimited chapter. Their president nearly choked when I described what had been done. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "this is exactly the kind of habitat destruction we've been fighting for decades. We'll back you, legal support, financial help, technical experts. Whatever it takes. These people just declared war on every fish in Colorado." Within 10 days, 3 government agencies had opened investigations. A University of Colorado environmental law clinic offered me free legal representation. And the evidence piled up fast enough to bury Peton and Associates in paperwork. But Brenda wasn't finished. Edwin tipped me off that she was already scheming her next escalation: a full flood control system, concreting the entire creek from the county road clear down to the subdivision boundary. Her logic: if we're going to do it, we should do it right. That night, I sat in my workshop surrounded by my grandfather's notebooks, poring over his photographs from the 1950s. He'd designed a system that had worked flawlessly for 70 years without a single flood incident. Brenda destroyed it in less than a week. But in doing so, she'd handed me something better than anger: ammunition. Enough federal violations to put her behind bars. If desperation has a scent, it smells like vanilla-scented candles burning too long, mixed with fierce sweat in a stuffy real estate office. And that's exactly where I found myself 3 weeks later, across from Brenda as she tried one last card. A manila envelope slid across her glass desk. Inside, a cashier's check for $500,000 and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to choke a horse. Her offer was simple, and blatantly illegal. Take the money, leave the county within 6 months, sign over my water rights, and shut up forever. Her threat was barely disguised. Legal fights are expensive, Dale. Even when you win, you lose. Think about Martha's job security. What Brenda didn't know. I'd brought a digital recorder, perfectly legal under Colorado's one-party consent laws. And her next words were gold. "If you don't take this deal, I'll make sure every property owner in this valley sees you as an extremist ruining property values." Your wife's teaching career. Complicated. By the time I left that office, I wasn't just angry. I was armed. The week after Brenda tried to buy me off, things got ugly. I came home one night to find my workshop ransacked. Vintage motorcycle parts, scattered across the floor. Tools missing. And my restored 1972 Harley Sportster tipped over, sugar poured in the gas tank like a playground prank gone nuclear. But here's the thing, they slipped up. The new security cameras I'd installed after the HOA drama started had caught everything. A clear shot of a white Tesla idling at the end of my driveway at 2 a.m., vanity plates shining under the floodlight. The war had gone from paper threats to psychological warfare. And it didn't stop there. Suddenly, anonymous online reviews started popping up for Martha's tutoring side business. Unprofessional. Political agenda. Unsafe influence on children. Next came the phone call to her principal, someone claiming she wasn't fit to teach because of her radical husband. Martha, usually calm as a saint, started losing sleep. I could see it in her eyes. The stress was eating away at both of us. I checked my blood pressure twice a day, watching the numbers creep higher than they should. But here's what Brenda miscalculated: engineers like me are methodical. We don't just react, we document. Every threat. Every scrap of vandalism. Every complaint. I logged them all with the precision of a federal case file. Because that's exactly what it was becoming. The EPA had already opened a formal investigation into the unauthorized concrete work. The Colorado Attorney General's office sent out investigators. Local environmental groups were treating Brenda's concrete channel like the Exxon Valdez of HOA disasters. And I wasn't fighting alone anymore. Sarah Olivia, a third-year law student at the University of Colorado, picked up my case as her senior project. She had the tenacity of a bloodhound with a briefcase, digging into HOA financial records until she struck gold. Mr. Brennan, she told me one evening, spreading documents across my cluttered workbench, this project didn't cost $127,000. It should have cost maybe $40,000, tops. The rest, nearly $90,000, vanished into consulting fees and emergency contractor premiums. And guess what? All of those companies trace back to Brenda's business network. Smoking guns where I'd only suspected smoke. It turned out Brenda wasn't just destroying my creek, she was robbing her neighbors blind. And the deeper Sarah dug, the dirtier it got. Secret board meetings. Contracts without competitive bidding. Special assessments funneled into vendettas. It was fraud, plain and simple. But the real breakthrough didn't come from law school research. It came from my grandfather's old notebooks. While flipping through his files, I found a consulting report he prepared for the county back in 1973. In it, he predicted exactly what Brenda's concrete channel would do. His calculations were crystal clear: concrete in that spot would increase downstream flooding risk by 300% during spring runoff. The report included flow charts, water tables, soil absorption rates, meticulous engineering detail from a man who'd survived Normandy and knew how to solve problems the right way. It wasn't just evidence. It was prophecy. Suddenly, I realized the delicious irony: Brenda thought she'd solved a flooding problem. In reality, she'd built a hydraulic time bomb aimed at her own neighborhood. The natural creek had spread runoff across a wide floodplain, absorbing water like a sponge. The concrete channel erased that buffer, turning spring snowmelt into a high-pressure cannon blasting straight toward million-dollar basements. And my property? Elevated, upstream, naturally shielded. Bone dry. Brenda's palace, though. Dead center of the blast zone. That weekend, I sat with my calculator, grandfather's flow charts, and Noah's weather predictions. The math was terrifying, and perfect. When the spring floods came, Brenda's pride project would backfire in spectacular fashion. The creek would claim its revenge with compound interest. Edwin stopped by Sunday night, catching me sketching restoration plans at the kitchen table. "Dale," he said, shaking his head, "this woman, she makes big mistake." I showed him the weather service reports: heavy snowpack, wet spring ahead, and then pointed to grandfather's engineering notes. "Edwin, she just built herself the world's most expensive lawsuit." He whistled low, the kind of sound you make when you see someone walking straight toward a cliff. Physics was about to finish the fight Brenda had started. On a gray February morning, Sarah Olivia walked into my workshop lugging a banker's box that looked heavy enough to dislocate her shoulder. She set it down on my bench with a thump that made my coffee mug rattle. "Mr. Brennan," she said, brushing snow off her coat, "you're going to want to sit for this." For 3 weeks, she'd been tearing through HOA financial records like a forensic accountant on a caffeine drip. What she'd found would have made the FBI's white-collar crime division weep tears of joy. The concrete channeling project that supposedly cost $127,000. The actual work was worth maybe $40,000. The missing $87,000 had evaporated into consulting fees and emergency contractor premiums. Follow the paper trail, and every penny led back to companies tied to Brenda's real estate network, Hartwell Property Consulting, Willowbrook Environmental Solutions, and a half-dozen shell firms that looked suspiciously alike. Brenda wasn't just a tyrant. She was a thief. But that wasn't the only bombshell that morning. 20 minutes later, Edwin shuffled in carrying a digital recorder like it was the Ark of the Covenant. "Dale," he said, his accent thick, his face serious. "Remember I tell you I vote no on concrete? I maybe forgot to mention, I recorded whole meeting." He pressed play, and Brenda's voice poured out crisp and damning. She wasn't talking about flood control. She was talking about getting rid of incompatible residents who didn't fit her community vision. She'd openly admitted the concrete project wasn't about erosion or safety. It was about pushing me, and anyone like me, out. She even bragged about weaponizing HOA funds to bury people in lawsuits, counting on the fact that most couldn't afford to fight back. The kicker? Her smug declaration that rural, working-class aesthetics had no place in her neighborhood. She wanted to scrub every trace of the valley's ranching heritage to inflate her real estate values. Listening to it, I felt my blood go cold. It wasn't just personal spite. It was calculated. But the real smoking gun was buried in my grandfather's old files. While prepping documents for the case, I stumbled across a folder labeled Willowbrook Development Consultation, 1973. Inside was a full hydrological analysis he'd done for the county. His conclusion: concrete channeling in this very location would eliminate the creek's natural absorption capacity, forcing 100% of runoff into the downstream floodplain. During heavy snowmelt years, like the one we were heading into, the result would be catastrophic flooding for homes built in the valley. Brenda's $1 million colonial sat smack in the center of that zone. The report even included topographical maps showing my land elevated safely above the danger while the subdivision occupied the natural overflow basin. My grandfather had practically written a prophecy: the creek will reclaim its floodplain eventually. Concrete will only make it angrier. When Sarah laid out the financial evidence next to my grandfather's engineering report, the pattern was undeniable. Brenda had siphoned nearly $90,000 from her neighbors to build a man-made flood machine that would destroy their own homes, while mine sat untouched. "This isn't just fraud," Sarah said, stacking documents into neat piles. "It's conspiracy, embezzlement, environmental destruction, maybe even racketeering. The EPA violations alone could put her in federal prison." Martha, who'd been quietly pouring coffee for everyone, studied the evidence with her teacher's knack for spotting patterns. She set her mug down with a grim finality. "She played herself," she said softly. "Every step she took to hurt us left a trail leading straight back to her." Outside, the February snow was already melting faster than normal, Cottonwood Creek running high inside its ugly concrete coffin. The Weather Service was predicting the heaviest spring runoff in 20 years. Brenda hadn't just destroyed a creek. She'd built herself a time bomb, and she'd handed me the evidence to prove it. The only question was whether I warned her neighbors, or let physics teach the lesson my grandfather's notes had predicted half a century ago. That night, my workshop looked less like a garage and more like a war room designed by paranoid engineers. Maps, legal papers, and financial records blanketed every surface. The smell of motor oil mixed with burnt coffee, the phone ringing every 10 minutes as new allies called offering help. In the corner sat my fully restored Harley, gleaming like a symbol of resurrection. Proof that even wrecks can be rebuilt stronger. And as I stared at my grandfather's notes under lamplight, one thought kept circling in my mind. Brenda thought she was in control. But she'd handed me the one thing she couldn't buy or bulldoze: time. And when the flood came, time would prove her wrong. By early March, my workshop no longer looked like a mechanic's garage. It looked like a command center. Stacks of maps, financial ledgers, and engineering notebooks covered every surface. The coffee pot ran constantly. Phones rang so often I considered installing a secretary's desk. And every night, Martha brought in sandwich platters to feed the steady stream of people crammed into our little war room. Even my Harley, finally restored after years of tinkering, sat gleaming in the corner, a reminder that things broken could be brought back to life. Fitting, given what we were plotting for Cottonwood Creek. Kate Morrison, an environmental lawyer from the University of Colorado's legal clinic, officially took my case pro bono after seeing Sarah's forensic accounting. Kate wasn't the ambulance-chasing type. She was a fighter, the kind who approached law like a chess master with a grudge. "Dale," she said one evening, spreading a timeline across my workbench, "we're not fighting one case, we're fighting 4. And if we do it right, we'll win all of them." Her plan was breathtaking in its precision. Federal case: Clean Water Act violations and habitat destruction. State case: water rights infringement and environmental permit fraud. County case: building code violations and improper special assessments. Civil case: fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and emotional distress. Each reinforced the others. Even if Brenda wriggled free from one, the others would crush her. And thanks to something Kate called the private attorney general doctrine, we could demand recovery of every legal expense if we won. The law practically encouraged citizens to sue violators when agencies couldn't keep up. Meanwhile, Sarah's investigation had snowballed. She pulled in 2 more law students and even a forensic accounting professor who treated HOA fraud like a Rubik's Cube he couldn't put down. They uncovered inflated contracts stretching back 3 years, landscaping, security systems, bogus, legal consulting. Total embezzlement: over $200,000. That wasn't civil fraud anymore. That was racketeering. The kind that earned prison time. On my end, I shifted gears from defense to design. Using my grandfather's original surveys and modern engineering models, I drafted a plan for creek restoration. The math was elegant. Natural channel design would not only restore fish habitat but also reduce flooding risk, at a cost of around $35,000. Less than half of what Brenda had wasted destroying it. Support poured in. Colorado Trout Unlimited pledged $25,000. The Sierra Club added $15,000. Local fishing clubs, environmental nonprofits, and even a few guilt-ridden HOA members chipped in. We called it the Cottonwood Creek Redemption Project. Weekly meetings in my workshop drew 30, sometimes 40 people. Veterans showed up, proud to see a combat engineer's grandson fighting bureaucratic idiocy. Martha launched a social media campaign, #SaveCottonwoodCreek, that ballooned to over 5,000 followers. And experts lined up to help. Dr. Angela Rodriguez from Colorado State's Environmental Engineering Department volunteered as an expert witness. She pored over my grandfather's 1973 analysis, running it through modern computer simulations. "Your grandfather was 50 years ahead of his time," she told me, pointing to one of his hand-drawn flow charts. "This is exactly how we design natural flood systems today." Brenda didn't just wreck a creek, she destroyed a sophisticated flood control system that had been protecting the valley for generations. Media coverage snowballed. Local reporters devoured the David versus Goliath angle. Environmental blogs spread the story nationwide. Even a Denver public television crew started filming a documentary. But the ace in our pocket was still my grandfather's evidence. His black and white photographs showed Cottonwood Creek gracefully handling floods for decades, no damage, no risk, just balance. Those images would devastate Brenda in court. And the weather was shaping up to make our case undeniable. Heavy snowpack in the Rockies. Warmer than usual spring forecasts. Storm systems lining up like artillery shells. The concrete trough was heading toward its first real test, and it would fail catastrophically. Meanwhile, Edwin played spy. He attended every HOA meeting and reported back. Brenda's allies were starting to panic, whispering about legal liability. 3 board members resigned, claiming they'd been misled. The HOA ship was sinking, and Brenda was still pretending to steer. The timeline accelerated daily. The EPA launched a formal investigation. The county DA announced a criminal probe into HOA finances. The state environmental agency issued a cease and desist order. Class action suits sprang up from other neighborhoods burned by Brenda-style HOAs. Every evening, Martha and I walked the scarred creek, planning its resurrection. The sound of water fighting against its concrete prison. The harsh chemical smell of curing cement in mountain air. "It's ugly," Martha said one night, "but temporary." "How long until we can fix it?" she asked. I calculated in my head, seasonal flooding, court timelines, construction schedules. "By next spring," I said. "This creek will be more beautiful than Granddad ever dreamed. But we've got to survive this spring first." Because nature was sharpening her blade. And physics doesn't grant extensions. If desperation has a smell, it's equal parts vanilla air freshener, fierce sweat, and the acrid stink of burning bridges. That's what filled Brenda's real estate office at 6:47 a.m. on March 3 when she called me in for an emergency sit-down. She slid another manila envelope across her glass desk, her pearl earrings catching the fluorescent light. Inside, a cashier's check for $750,000 and a non-disclosure agreement so thick it could have doubled as a doorstop. Her new deal was straightforward. Take the money. Move out of Colorado. Sign over my water rights to a conservation trust run by the HOA. And promise to never speak publicly about the creek, environmental law, or HOA governance again. The threat wasn't subtle. Legal battles destroy families, Dale. Ask Martha how her teaching career would survive if the school board found out her husband's a radical environmental activist. What she didn't know. My digital recorder was running again, still perfectly legal in Colorado. Her next words were prosecutorial gold. "If you don't take this final offer, I'll make sure every contractor, every supplier, every business owner in this valley knows you're poison. Your wife's tutoring business, your hobby, your reputation, all of it can disappear. I have connections you can't even imagine." That same night, my workshop got hit again. This time, they weren't just vandalizing, they were sending a message. My restored Harley lay on its side, frame bent, 40 hours of restoration destroyed in minutes. Granddad's notebooks were scattered across the oil-stained floor, some pages torn, others soaked in motor oil. But they slipped up again. The upgraded security system caught it all, high-definition footage of 2 hooded figures wrecking my shop, followed by a white Tesla with vanity plates picking them up at 2:17 a.m. One of the vandals wore $300 sneakers I'd seen before, on Brenda's 17-year-old son. The campaign escalated from physical sabotage to digital warfare. Anonymous reviews flooded Martha's tutoring page, unprofessional. Political indoctrination. Unsafe for children. Fake social media accounts popped up, spreading lies about me, claims that I'd been dishonorably discharged from the army, that I had violent tendencies, that I was mentally unstable. Parents pulled their kids from Martha's tutoring program after receiving anonymous letters warning them about dangerous extremists. Her principal even called her in for a concerned conversation. The stress gnawed at us like rust. Martha barely slept. I paced the house at night, checking doors, glancing at the floodlight camera every time it clicked on. But here's what Brenda failed to understand: engineers don't panic. We document every break-in, every threat, every fake review, every smear. I filed it all with the precision of a federal investigator. Because that's exactly what it had become. The FBI's white-collar crime unit opened a file on the HOA's financial fraud. Agent Lisa Park started digging through bank records with Sarah's forensic accounting as a roadmap. The EPA's Criminal Enforcement Division joined in, led by Agent Tom Rodriguez, building a case on the environmental violations. Sarah's analysis had already uncovered nearly $200,000 siphoned through fraudulent HOA contracts. The feds didn't see just an arrogant HOA president, they saw a conspiracy. And the cracks in Brenda's empire widened fast. Edwin reported that during the last board meeting, she'd screamed at 3 members, accusing them of betrayal for questioning legal bills. 2 more resigned on the spot, leaving Brenda with only one loyal ally. The HOA, once a smug army behind her, was unraveling into a handful of panicked homeowners staring down lawsuits, government investigations, and the looming spring floods. Meanwhile, Mother Nature was warming up. March temperatures ran 15 degrees above average. The National Weather Service issued early flood watches for the Front Range. Cottonwood Creek surged to 150% of its normal flow, and peak snowmelt hadn't even begun. Each evening, I strapped on boots and waded into the icy current, measuring flow rates and documenting how the concrete trough handled the rising water. The results? Exactly what my grandfather had predicted 50 years earlier. Instead of spreading across a floodplain, the creek's water was funneled into a narrow, high-pressure stream aimed straight at the HOA's million-dollar foundations. Dr. Rodriguez from Colorado State ran simulations confirming it. Once peak runoff hit, the channel's water velocity would reach foundation-destroying levels. Insurance companies were already asking questions about unauthorized modifications to drainage systems. Translation: flood coverage might not apply at all. Out in the community, the tide shifted. Local businesses hung "Support Dale" signs in their windows. The high school environmental club adopted creek restoration as their senior project. Veterans groups called it an attack on one of our own. Regional fishing clubs and environmental organizations elevated my case into a statewide symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny. But Brenda wasn't finished. Edwin warned me she was planning something desperate, maybe private security, maybe trying to slap me with a restraining order by labeling me a danger to the community. That night, Martha found me hunched over my grandfather's notebooks and the latest weather reports. "How bad is it going to get?" she asked quietly. I didn't look up. The maps told the story. Heavy snowpack. Soaring March temps. A concrete channel that turned runoff into a weapon. Bad enough to end this, I said. One way or another. The phone rang at 5:23 a.m. on March 15th, jolting me awake with the kind of urgency you don't ignore. It was Edwin, whispering like he was reporting from behind enemy lines. "Dale, listen. Brenda, she is moving. Big truck. Middle of night. Very suspicious." I pulled on jeans and boots, then drove past her house just as dawn lit the mountains gold. Sure enough, a commercial moving truck sat in her driveway, expensive furniture stacked like she was fleeing a war zone. Her Tesla was already stuffed with personal boxes. The woman who had spent 6 months trying to drive me out of the valley was quietly planning her own retreat. But before disappearing, she played one last, reckless card. An hour later, Sarah called with news that turned my coffee to battery acid. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice clipped, "Brenda just filed for an emergency restraining order against you. Claims you've been stalking her family and making terrorist threats against HOA property. She's invoking federal protection statutes." The paperwork was a masterpiece of fiction. According to Brenda's sworn affidavit, I was a disgruntled veteran with anger issues, conducting surveillance of HOA families and threatening to sabotage their community infrastructure. She even included photographs of me measuring creek flow as evidence of reconnaissance activity. The hearing? Scheduled the same week peak snowmelt was forecast. Coincidence? Not a chance. She knew the floods were coming. If she could keep me legally barred from the creek, no one would be there to document the disaster as it unfolded. That afternoon, my house turned into a war council. Kate arrived with a legal brief thick enough to use as body armor. Dr. Rodriguez brought real-time modeling data showing the concrete channel's water velocity climbing to catastrophic levels. Sarah dumped more evidence on the table, tying Brenda's finances to shell companies and fraudulent contracts. Kate laid it out bluntly, she's stalling. If Brenda can gag you with a restraining order until after the floods, she buys time. By the time the water proves us right, there'll be no legal record of it. Meanwhile, the National Weather Service upgraded its alert to a flash flood warning. Snowpack was melting faster than anyone predicted, multiple storm systems converging on Colorado like a perfect storm. Cottonwood Creek was already running at double its usual March flow, and the real deluge hadn't even arrived. But Brenda had overlooked one fatal detail. The restraining order required her to testify in federal court, under oath. Which meant she'd have to spin her lies in front of a judge while prosecutors held recordings of her bribery attempts, threats, and financial fraud. Agent Lisa Park from the FBI had been quietly building her case for weeks, following Sarah's forensic trail through Brenda's business network. Nearly $200,000 had been siphoned off through fraudulent contracts and kickbacks. Add in witness intimidation, attempted bribery, and environmental crimes, and Brenda wasn't just facing lawsuits, she was staring down federal prison time. The night before the hearing, I sat in my workshop cleaning my grandfather's service revolver. Not because I expected violence, but because rituals clear the mind. Outside, the creek roared. Spring melt turned Brenda's concrete trench into a pressurized water cannon aimed at the very homes it was supposed to protect. Martha found me hunched over flood projections by lamplight. Tomorrow changes everything, doesn't it? One way or another, I said, listening to the water hammer against cement. Either the court does its job, or physics delivers the verdict. Media attention had reached fever pitch. Denver news stations planned live coverage of both the hearing and the rising floodwaters. Environmental blogs dubbed it the Creek War. Sarah uncovered one last piece of the puzzle. Brenda's family had already purchased a home in Florida. She was liquidating assets, closing accounts, shifting money offshore. Proof she wasn't planning a comeback, she was planning an escape. That evening, Edwin stopped by with intel from the HOA's final meeting. Only Brenda and one ally showed up, while furious homeowners demanded answers about flood insurance and legal liability. Several families had already filed suit against the HOA for voiding coverage by altering natural drainage. Dale, Edwin said grimly, this woman, she makes herself enemy of everyone. Even people who voted yes for concrete now see truth. They hate her more than you. The irony was perfect. She'd spent months trying to turn the neighborhood against me. In the end, her greed and arrogance had isolated her completely. Tomorrow, a federal courtroom would decide if the law protected people like me from HOA tyranny. But out in the valley, the snowmelt didn't care about legal schedules. Physics was ready to pass its own judgment. The federal courthouse in Denver was packed tighter than a sardine can on March 22. The lobby overflowed with people watching live streams, while outside, news crews jostled for space. Inside, Judge Martha Blackwood, no relation to Martha, but a woman with a reputation for chewing up corporate lawyers, presided. Local media had already christened it the Creek War trial. The gallery was a patchwork of veterans, environmentalists, neighbors burned by HOA abuse, and ordinary citizens who just wanted to see justice land where it belonged. Meanwhile, outside those walls, Cottonwood Creek thundered toward historic flood levels. Kate Morrison led with an opening statement sharp as a scalpel. Your Honor, this case is about more than one stream. It's about the systematic destruction of a century-old ecosystem to satisfy one woman's vendetta against a neighbor who refused to submit. She laid it bare. Brenda hadn't just broken environmental law, she'd embezzled nearly $200,000 from her own community to fund it. Brenda's lawyer, a nervous junior from Peton and Associates, tried to paint me as some radical environmentalist blocking legitimate flood control. His voice cracked every time he said the word necessary. Then Kate pressed play. The courtroom went dead silent as Brenda's own voice filled the speakers. Her smug offers of bribes. Her threats against Martha's career. Her admissions that the concrete project had nothing to do with flood safety and everything to do with pushing out undesirable residents. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the court stenographer looked shaken. "Your Honor," Kate said, steady as a surgeon, the defendant's own words prove this was never about protecting homes. It was about abusing HOA authority to enforce economic cleansing. When it was my turn to testify, I kept it simple. 30 years of Army Corps experience boiled down into plain English. I walked the judge through my grandfather's 1973 report, showing how he predicted this exact disaster half a century ago. Then Dr. Rodriguez took the stand. He presented real-time flood monitoring data, maps glowing on a screen behind him. "Your Honor," he said, "as we sit in this courtroom, Cottonwood Creek is approaching record flow. This concrete installation has created an imminent threat to public safety. Peak runoff will transform it into a fire hose aimed at residential foundations." The timing couldn't have been more poetic. Midway through testimony, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood emergency. Court officers hustled to evacuate the basement level. When we reconvened, Brenda looked like a ghost in pearl earrings. Her lawyer frantically checked his phone, probably watching disaster updates roll in from Willowbrook Estates. Kate delivered the mic drop. "Your Honor, while we've been in session, the defendant's concrete project has begun flooding the very homes it was supposed to protect. Crews are pumping water out of basements in Willowbrook right now. Meanwhile, Mr. Brennan's property, upstream, untouched, remains bone dry." Helicopter footage aired live on courtroom monitors, million-dollar homes drowning under muddy water while my shabby workshop sat safely above it all. Brenda cracked. On live TV, no less. She shrieked that I'd orchestrated the flood, that environmentalists had weaponized the weather, that she was the victim of eco-terrorists. Judge Blackwood cut her off. "Miss Hartwell, control yourself or be held in contempt. The court has heard enough." During the lunch recess, FBI agents served warrants on Brenda's financial records. EPA officials cordoned off the creek site as a crime scene. The Colorado Attorney General's team arrived with evidence of statewide HOA fraud. The afternoon session was practically ceremonial. Judge Blackwood ruled on every count. Clean Water Act violations, guilty. Water rights infringement, guilty. Fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, intentional distress, guilty. She ordered immediate removal of all concrete, full creek restoration, and damages totaling $750,000, including attorney fees and punitive fines. But more importantly, she set a precedent: water rights were protected from HOA overreach. A blueprint for homeowners everywhere to fight back. Outside, the press swarmed. Environmental groups hailed it as a landmark victory. Veterans pinned a medal of appreciation on my jacket. High schoolers handed Martha thank you cards with hand-drawn trout on the front. But the sweetest moment wasn't in front of cameras. That evening, while emergency crews pumped water out of Brenda's flooded basement, Martha and I stood on our porch listening to the creek roaring where it belonged. "Justice sounds like running water," she whispered. And for the first time in months, it flowed free. 2 weeks after Judge Blackwood's ruling, Willowbrook Estates looked like a war zone. Piles of ruined furniture lined curbs, sump pumps hummed night and day, and contractors in hip waders slogged through knee-deep mud. Brenda's colonial mansion sat gutted, the marble floors warped, drywall peeled away like soggy paper. The queen of the HOA now lived in a rented condo 30 miles away, her empire reduced to a foreclosure notice taped on the front door. And the law kept hammering. The FBI indicted her on 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of racketeering. The EPA piled on environmental destruction charges. State prosecutors added theft and misuse of HOA funds. When she finally appeared in federal court again, she traded her pearl earrings for an orange jumpsuit. Her smirk had vanished. She pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for reduced sentencing, but the damage was permanent. She was stripped of her licenses, barred from any HOA involvement for life, and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The HOA itself didn't survive either. Within a month, homeowners voted 89% to dissolve it entirely. The county appointed an independent trustee to oversee property maintenance until individual agreements could replace the bureaucracy. For the first time in decades, families in Willowbrook were free of fines for mailbox colors, garden gnomes, and the tyranny of arbitrary rules. Meanwhile, Cottonwood Creek began its resurrection. The court settlement, combined with donations from environmental groups, funded the full restoration plan I'd drafted. Crews tore out the concrete, truckload after truckload, until the valley looked raw but alive again. Volunteers, students, veterans, fishermen, even neighbors who'd once voted against me, showed up with gloves and shovels. Together we planted willow shoots, seeded native grasses, and placed boulders exactly where my grandfather's old notes suggested. The creek responded instantly, finding its rhythm, weaving through stones like it had been waiting for this moment. On dedication day, the county hosted a ceremony by the water's edge. Reporters gathered, kids released hatchery trout into the stream, and a bronze plaque was unveiled. Cottonwood Creek Restoration Project. In honor of Dale Brennan, grandson of William Brennan, whose stewardship preserved this land for generations. I'll admit, I felt my throat tighten. Granddad's calculations, once scribbled in pencil, had become living proof that wisdom lasts longer than concrete. Martha stood beside me, her hand in mine. Her tutoring business had not only recovered but thrived after the trial. Parents saw her as a pillar of resilience. The smear campaigns had backfired spectacularly. Edwin became something of a local folk hero. His secret recording was replayed on news stations nationwide. At the ceremony, he leaned over and whispered, "Dale, you see? Sometimes the quiet man wins the loudest battle." The press kept calling it a David versus Goliath victory. But I never saw myself as David. I saw myself as an engineer, doing what engineers do, fixing what was broken, protecting what mattered, and refusing to back down when the math proved me right. Months later, standing on my porch at sunset, I listened to the creek's music, gentle, balanced, alive. No concrete echo. No artificial roar. Just water moving where it belonged. Martha joined me, handing over 2 mugs of coffee. "Think Brenda hears this sound from prison?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, smiling. "But the real lesson isn't for her. It's for everyone else who thought one bully with money could silence the truth." Cottonwood Creek flowed steady, eternal, unbroken. And in its current, I finally felt peace.